Okay, so chapter 19. Chapter 19 is going to take us to early Latin America. We're going to be looking again, as we have been in chapters 16, 17, 18. We're going to be continuing to look at the time period of 1450 to 1750. Now, it is almost difficult to underestimate the changes and the devastation that went on in the Americas between 1450 and 1750. It is tremendous. It just so much changes this part of the world, and that's where we're going. All right. So, what changes this part of the world? Well, what changes this part of the world is the arrival of the Europeans. We all know Columbus reaches the Caribbean islands sometime in 1492. We're not sure which island he landed on, but he definitely got there. He'll eventually reach the mainland, as will other explorers. And really, predominantly, the early civilization into the Americas is the Spanish, with the Portuguese to a lesser degree, but they are there in Brazil. And these two countries are both on the Iberian Peninsula. And thus, the first slide here, Iberian society and tradition. What do the Iberians bring to the Americas? Well, first of all, both cultures are strongly urbanized, so they're going to try to build cities. Um, this isn't a number two. This is a chance for Iberian commoners to come seek their wealth and raise their status in the Americas. You say, well, why don't rich people come over here from Spain and Portugal? Well, kind of obvious, right? If they're already rich, why would they come here and risk their lives, risk their fortunes, trying to make it here in the Americas if they're already rich? So most of these guys who come over, not all of them, but most of them are middle to lower middle class. They're going to bring the idea of encomiendas, the idea of large estates. Those are going to be, eventually they'll turn into plantations. They're going to bring over an Iberian patriarchal culture. Latin America remains very patriarchal, will be extremely patriarchal during this time. Does everybody remember what patriarchal means? It's right, pater, dominated by the father. Slavery. Slavery has died off during this time period in most of Europe, at least building up to this time period. But that's not going to stay. That is not true in Spain and Portugal. They've had a large Muslim population. They've had a lot of contacts with Muslims. They've had a lot of contacts with Africa, and they are very comfortable buying and selling people. The rest of Europe will get there pretty quickly. They'll come to buying and selling people when they realize it makes them big money. They'll be there too. Also, Spain and Portugal both have centralized governments. They're going to bring that over. Lots of bureaucrats, lots of lawyers. There's a very close tie between the church and the state. That is going to continue into today, where the Catholic Church still has a tremendous influence in Latin America. And last point there, they're going to bring all this to the Americas. Okay, so the first place they arrive when they get here is the Caribbean. And the crucible here, the kind of the example, the core example of all this is going to be that native Indians become laborers. We're going to look at that system, the encomienda system. They take natives, and essentially it's kind of like a feudal system where they say you can live here, but you got to give the owner, the big guy, certain amount of labor and or food as payment. And they're going to bring that. They build their cities in a grid pattern with a central plaza, a nice little square. That goes all the way back to our friends, the Romans. The Romans taught them to do that, and that Spain will continue that. Professional bureaucrats, I mentioned that a minute ago. A lot of these guys are lawyers, highly educated, very skilled, and working as a bureaucrat in the Spanish or Portuguese government was considered a good position, a very good position. If any of you read the Moore's account as your book reading, you'll come across that. Most of this is in the 16th century, which means the 1500s. The Caribbean's going to go through kind of a unique phase. They're going to be really popular when Columbus first gets here. They're going to be someplace, they're looking desperately for gold. They don't find much of it on the islands, but they're looking desperately for gold, and they kind of set themselves up on the islands. But the islands are going to lose their value because there's no easy gold. The natives die off due to diseases and exploitation. And so everything kind of moves to the mainland. But then once sugar becomes popular as a crop, as a cash crop, the islands are going to make a big comeback then. All right. And with that, they're going to bring African slaves, and Spanish women will arrive, and we have a new society. Two major conquests are the conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas. Now, we talked about the Aztecs a little while back. In 1519, Cortez goes deep into Mexico and comes across Tenochtitlan and attacks the Aztecs in 1519. He eventually kills the emperor, Moctezuma II. The thing about Moctezuma II is Aztecs were weakened before Cortez got there because smallpox had beat them to the city. And smallpox was incredibly deadly to the Native Americans. They had no immunities against it. They had no way to fight off. They had been isolated for 10, maybe 20,000 years and had no contact with Eurasian diseases. So when smallpox popped up, it was devastating to parts of Eurasia, but they developed immunities to it and life went on. The Native Americans will as well, the Amerindians, but it's going to take a while. Okay. There's also been a civil war. So Cortez arrives, has some breaks go his way, and will take over the city. The other famous one is Francisco Pizarro. And Pizarro attacks the Incas down in South America, down in the Andes Mountains. He began his conquest in 1532. It's an interesting little story. He was actually off exploring in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America, and he came across a canoe of Native Americans and discovered that they had jewelry. It was nice looking jewelry, had some gold and all that. He was very interested. And they're like, oh, yes, we've got a place with plenty of this. He arrives in Cusco, which is the capital of the Incan Empire. Interesting background there. Again, he is helped out by the arrival of smallpox before he got there, really slammed the Incas, and it led to a civil war because the heir, the king, the Sapa Inca, whichever term you like to use, dies. And when the Sapa Inca dies, at that moment, it's not clear who the next heir should be. So we have a civil war, so they'll fight each other. So smallpox kills warriors, warfare kills warriors, and then the Spanish arrive. Pizarro and Cortez both get people to join their army, not because they're great soldiers, not because they have this history of being warriors or great men back in the Iberian Peninsula, back in Spain. None of that. They just say to their guys, hey, you come with me, I'm going to get you rich. So followers get loot, but you always have to give 20% of whatever you get to the king. At least you're supposed to. That doesn't mean that always happens, but you're supposed to. And the crown knows that they're getting cheated some, but they're getting rich, so they can live with it. Diseases. Cannot underestimate the impact of diseases. Smallpox in particular, but measles, flu, the mumps will all slam Native Americans. But the big killer, smallpox. And just to give you an example, they're fairly certain that the numbers that Mexico, what we consider Mexico today, the Valley of Mexico may have had as many as 25 million Native Americans living in it. After the Europeans arrive, due to diseases, exploitation, overworking of labor, that number drops to less than 2. That's over a 90% decrease in population. Now, there's much debate about if you take all of the Americas, how many were wiped out. When I was a student, they were talking 50 to 60%. Now the number's up to, they estimate 80%. And some will push it to 90% or more of Native Americans died before they developed immunities and their population made a rebound. But those are significant numbers. That's a pretty successful genocide. Even if it's unintended, it's pretty successful. So I mentioned exploitation wiping out Native Americans. One of the things the Spanish use is they use something called the encomienda system. Now I said the encomienda system is kind of like feudal system. It'd be like if you came and took over Frederick County, Winchester. All right, there are a lot of people living here already. And you say, well, I now, as conqueror of Frederick County, Winchester, own this place. And therefore, you are allowed to continue to work here. You're allowed to grow crops as long as you give me some of what you grow and you provide me with labor. Now, you can guess pretty quickly what's the problem there. What did I just tell you happens to Amerindians when they're around Europeans? That's right, they die of diseases. So they're going to die from your contact. A lot of them are going to die. Then you being Spanish and looking down upon these people, they do not look like me. Racial attitudes have begun by this point. Really in the mid 1400s, we actually get a book in Portugal where a guy lays out the idea that people darker than white Europeans are somehow inferior. And they get here, these people are dark as well. They're savages. They're not Christian. You can abuse them. And a lot of that goes on. As native populations decline, they've got to look for alternatives. Plus, some priests, some monks, but priests who've come to the Americas are appalled at how the Spanish are treating the Native Americans, the Amerindians. And so they push the crown to make some changes. Also, they're motivated not just by the deaths, not just by the abuse, but also here, there's a fear of a new nobility. What I mean by that is some of these guys who started these big haciendas, plantations using the encomienda system are starting to get rich themselves. And remember I said these guys are not rich historically. They're not of the aristocratic class. So the aristocratic class back in Spain is looking at this going, oh, those guys don't come from the right kinds of families. No. We can't have them be nobility. So they outlawed the encomienda system. However, two things. Number one, what I underlined there. They continue to force Native Americans to work in mines and Native Americans, Amerindians, to work on state projects like roads, things like that. They particularly like them in the mines because some of the silver, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, that's found at altitude, Africans and Europeans do not do well at altitude. Amerindians do much better at altitude. So they'll take them and force them to work in these. Plus, an unintended consequence of some of these priests pushing to stop using Native Americans as cheap labor, stop abusing them, is that they'll switch over to using African slaves, which is just as bad, if not worse. Okay. Haciendas, I mentioned them. These are Spanish agricultural states. There's something interesting about this. They produce for domestic use. Now, if you remember from your homework and earlier discussions, we talked about a philosophy called mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that the mother countries, and that's probably not a good term, the home countries back in Europe get rich because what they use is they use the colonies to provide them with cheap raw materials, and they send over all the finished products. So the idea is that you're heavily dependent upon the home country back in Europe. But once these haciendas start to produce for themselves, start to produce for an American markets here in the Americas, these guys are going to see themselves as independent. They're not going to see themselves as tied to Europe, and they're really going to push for independence. And it does, despite the efforts of the rich back in Spain and Portugal, does create a new aristocracy here in the Americas. One of the big things they come across, and the first, we're going to talk a lot about plantations and cotton and sugar and tobacco and coffee and those kind of things later on. But when the Europeans first get here, that's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for plantation agriculture. Instead, what they're looking for is they're looking for the quick buck. The quick buck is found in gold, at least initially. And gold is somewhat plentiful in certain parts of the Americas, and they do pretty well. But the big one, it's silver. Silver trade is preeminent. Spaniards see it only for themselves. They'll bring convoys over from the Americas back to Spain, and they'll be protected by galleons, which are little fleets of ships with Navy ships along to protect them. And they will bring them. You'll notice on the map, I've got them going back to Spain, and I also have them heading off to Manila, which is in the Philippines. You remember how they got the Philippines? That's right. When Magellan sailed around the world, after he crossed the Pacific Ocean, the first place he bumps into really is the Philippines, and he'll claim them for Spain. Okay. So they're sending silver over to Spain. That's a future discussion. Over to Philippines, Spain is sending it to the Philippines. And that's going to have a big impact on China, because what they're going to do is they are going to buy a lot of goods from China using Spanish silver. So China's going to see a large influx of silver and an influx of Spanish silver, and Chinese goods are going to come to Spain. Sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. So Spain and Portugal, these are the two big explorers early. Portugal's first, Spain second. Portugal's trying to get around Africa to India, and that's their goal. Spain decides not to go around Africa. Remember, they send Columbus west across the Atlantic, and he bumps into the Americas. So Spain claims the Americas for themselves. But Portugal, and if you look at this map, when they were trying to get around Africa, one of the things they run into off this part of Africa is storms blowing across the Atlantic Ocean. And in order to avoid those storms, they'll swing wide out into the Atlantic. Eventually, one of these guys swings wide enough that he bumps into what we know today as Brazil, and he claims it for Portugal. Well, what are we going to do? America is claimed by Spain, and at least part of it is claimed by Portugal. So the Pope steps in and says, I will draw the Treaty of Tordesillas. And you'll see they got the 1493 line and the 1494 line. 1493 line is obviously the first of them. And the Pope basically says everything to the east of it is Portuguese. Everything to the west of it belongs to Spain. And you say, wait a minute, there are a lot of people there. Well, the Pope said as long as these lands are unoccupied. You say, well, they were occupied. There were lots of people living there. But they had to be occupied by Catholic Christians. If the Spanish and the Portuguese were given permission by the church, if they came across any non-Catholic places, they could claim them as their own. Of course, they were supposed to convert them. Okay. Brazil gives our first plantation economy. At first, they're interested in dyewoods. There's some money to be made from that. But what really gets the plantation system going, and I'm leading into the second bullet point there, is what you see in the picture there on your right, and that is sugar. Sugar is very labor intensive, and there are problems. We mentioned them already with the encomienda system, with people dying, with diseases, with abuse of natives. So they have to bring in, that's right, African slaves. In this Brazilian economy, white plantation owners dominate society. Slaves are at the bottom. There's a great variety in between. We'll talk about that a little more. Um, Administration in Portuguese Brazil is run by lawyers. They've got regional governors, and they'll also set up missionary ranch. They run ranches and schools. And that's something else that's going to lead the Americas to independence. Because what's going to happen is the Americas are going to start their own schools. So now, back up just a second. Before we get to the independence movements, think about what's going on in the Americas. Guys are risking their lives coming from Spain or Portugal. They're working to get rich. They're own slaves. They've got haciendas where they're growing for themselves. They're not dependent upon Europe. And they've got their own schools, so they don't even have to go back to Europe to get educated. They're going to start to think of themselves not as Spanish and Portuguese, although they still do, even up to the independence movements around 1800. But they start to see themselves as Americans, and that's a big step. Brazil does go through an age of gold where they discover gold. In 1695, the government tries to control the production. There are a couple of impacts. Before this, the Portuguese have only hung around the coast. Now, once they find gold in the interior of Brazil, they're going to move into Brazil, and that will allow them to develop the interior of the country. And Rio becomes the new capital as it is closer to the gold mines. But the big one, I've said it already, the big one is sugar. As gold ran out on the Caribbean islands in Brazil, the Portuguese and later the Spanish found a new source of wealth, and that is sugar plantations. In fact, Brazil's first sugar plantations are in northern Brazil, modern day northern Brazil. And demographically, that is still today where you see most people of African descent living in Brazil. Sugar production and the subsequent use of African slaves began in Brazil and spread all over the Caribbean and to the North America, to the British colonies in North America. African slaves were used to replace Amerindians because of high death rate among natives. Remember, they die of diseases, abuse, hard work. But this hard work kills slaves too. In fact, it's going to bring a lot of slaves from Africa because so many of them are going to die. There are stories that the average life expectancy of a male worker on a sugar plantation was 23. After the slaves, if you were a male slave of working age to work in the sugar industry, your life expectancy was 2 or 3 years after you arrived in the Americas from Africa. Obviously, they have to keep replenishing that supply, so they bring a lot of slaves end up in these two places. Brazilian society. I said I'd mention how it's organized. We've got the Peninsulares at the top. You look at that word. They're obviously Europeans who were born on the peninsula. Which peninsula? Iberian Peninsula, which means they're either Spanish or Portuguese. We also have mestizos, which are a blending of Amerindian and Europeans. At the term used at the time, and we're going to use it in a historical setting. However, it is not used today in polite company outside of talking about history and referring to the time because it comes to derive such negative connotations. But mulattoes, who are a blending of African and European. And then, of course, at the bottom are Native Americans and slaves. Okay, so let me do those 5 again. Peninsulares, European descent, born back in Europe. Creoles, European descent, born here in the Americas. Mestizos, blending of European and Amerindian. Mulattoes, blending of European and African. And slaves and Native Americans. And by the way, that was a strict society. They were very regimented. Now, it's kind of weird for us to think of it, because really what happens is there's a lot of intermarrying among racial groups. However, if you are there is also a strong racist tendency that the lighter your skin, the more preferable you are. Okay, kind of weird. Intermarriage, yet still pretty racist society. In North America, it's racist and there's no intermarriage. We don't want anything to do with those Native Americans. There is, towards the end of this time period, a shifting balance of power in the Americas. France, England, Holland are going to get in on the Americas game. When they do that, they're going to weaken Spanish and the Portuguese influence in the Americas. Also, at the end of this time period, leading up to 1750, silver imports fall off to Spain from Mexico and Peru, because those are the two big places it's mined, Mexico and Peru. Just to give you some idea of how violent and how ugly this mining must have been, because they used Native Americans at the high altitudes in Peru to mine for silver. The Spanish liked children to do the mining because they were small and they could fit in small spaces, but they used mercury to help get the silver out of the rock. I know you're sitting there thinking, Mr. McKernan, silver is poisonous. It is poisonous. And the work for the children in the mines was deadly, maimed them. There are stories of Native Americans, Amerindians in Peru, actually crushing their children's hands, maiming their children so they would not have to go work in the mines. That's how awful it was. And the colonies have also started to become self-sufficient. So the purpose of this slide is to say to you, Spanish and Portuguese control in the Americas is starting to slip by 1750. Again, loss of overseas territory, loss of silver, colonies becoming more self-sufficient, and number 4, pressure from France, England, and Holland. All right, at the end of this time period, there are the Bourbon reforms. And the Bourbon reforms try to revive the Spanish dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty in Spain wanted to revive Spain. They felt they could reform the government, do a better job with the bureaucracy. However, they're going to do something that's going to tick off the Creoles. Because remember, those Creoles are European descendants born here in the Americas. They've made their money in the Americas. They've been educated in the Americas. And then along comes they've achieved positions of political power in the Americas. Along comes the Bourbon dynasty from Spain and says, no, we're going to send over people from the peninsula to run yours. And these moves anger Creoles and helped inspire later independence. In fact, in some ways, they're going to ally themselves with France against Spain and Portugal. And France is willing to pay to help out these colonies kick out, like they did with us, some kick out because it hurts their European rivals. I'm almost to the end. Last but not least, at the end of this time period, there's the 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Years' War does not involve Spain and Portugal. However, remember I mentioned a couple of slides ago that France and England were getting in on this game. Well, eventually this conflict in North America will lead to what is known as the rest of the world as the 7 Years' War, frequently in American history as that's right, French and Indian War. Good job. We want to extend the British descendants on the colonies on the coast want to extend their empire deeper into the Americas and come against the French and the Native Americans. They're going to settle California. States going to take more control of the economy, and monopoly companies develop in new regions. A couple of points to know about the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War. It's a war between France and England. England wins for the most part. Now, obviously, they don't wipe out France. Some people call it the First Great World War because they're going to fight in Europe, they're going to fight in the Americas, and they're going to fight in Asia. England gets India out of the bargain at the end and some other colonies. They get some territory in North America. The French get Haiti, which now seems like a not a great gift, but in 1763, Haiti was a sugar plantation colony and it was making a lot of money. So it wasn't that bad. We'll talk about what happens to Haiti later on. And that's got me. So we did 1450 to 1750 in the Americas. What I talked predominantly about was Latin America, Spain, Portugal. We said they come in looking for gold, cheap metals. They get some gold, they get a lot of silver. But they also discovered that plantation agriculture can make them rich. Eventually, Holland, France, and England get in the game. They settle mostly in North America, but they'll weaken Spanish and Portuguese control, along with a growing independence among people in the Americas who see themselves as something special because they have done it all on their own. Okay, please remember to submit a copy of your notes. You can just take pictures of your notes, handwritten notes, and submit those to me. I greatly appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing and talking to you again.